On the night of April 25, 1986, workers at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine prepared to conduct what they believed would be a routine safety test. The facility, located just 18 kilometers from the city of Pripyat and 110 kilometers north of Kiev, was one of the Soviet Union's most important energy installations. Reactor number 4, the newest addition to the complex, was scheduled for a maintenance shutdown, providing the perfect opportunity to test whether the turbine could generate enough electrical power to keep crucial safety systems running during an emergency. The test itself seemed reasonable on paper. In the event of a power failure, backup diesel generators would take approximately 60 seconds to reach full power and restore electricity to the reactor's cooling pumps. This brief gap represented a vulnerability in the plant's safety systems. The engineers wanted to know if the spinning turbine, as it wound down, could generate enough residual electricity to bridge that critical minute-long gap. It was a question that had been asked before, with previous attempts at the test proving inconclusive. But this night would be different, not because the test would finally succeed, but because it would trigger the worst nuclear disaster in human history. By 1:23 a.m. on April 26, Reactor 4 exploded with a force equivalent to roughly 500 tons of TNT, blowing off its 1,000-ton concrete and steel lid and releasing radioactive material 400 times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion would send a plume of radioactive particles into the atmosphere that would spread across the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, and even parts of Western Europe. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic. 2 plant workers, Valery Kodymchuk and Vladimir Shashanok, were killed instantly in the explosion. 28 more people, mostly firefighters and reactor operators, would die within weeks from acute radiation sickness. Over the following months and years, hundreds of thousands of liquidators, emergency workers, soldiers, and volunteers would be exposed to dangerous levels of radiation as they fought to contain the disaster. An area of approximately 2,600 square kilometers around the plant, including the entire city of Pripyat, with its 49,000 residents, would be evacuated and remain largely uninhabited to this day. The human cost was staggering, but the political and social consequences would prove equally profound. The Chernobyl disaster would expose the fundamental weaknesses of the Soviet system, its culture of secrecy, its unwillingness to acknowledge failure, and its tendency to prioritize political considerations over technical realities. Many historians argue that Chernobyl played a significant role in accelerating the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The disaster shattered the illusion of Soviet technological superiority and revealed the dangers of a system where no one dared to question authority, even when lives hung in the balance. Yet the most haunting aspect of the Chernobyl disaster was not that it happened, but that it was entirely preventable. The explosion resulted from a combination of flawed reactor design, inadequate safety culture, and a series of critical decisions made by operators who violated multiple safety protocols during the test. At the center of these decisions stood one man, Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer who supervised the test and insisted it proceed despite mounting evidence that conditions were becoming dangerous. His refusal to halt the experiment, combined with a hierarchical Soviet culture that discouraged subordinates from challenging their superiors, set the stage for catastrophe. This is the story of the secret behind the Chernobyl explosion, the decision that nobody dared to question. It's a story about human ambition and institutional failure, about technological hubris and the price of silence, and about how one fateful night exposed the fault lines of an entire empire. To understand why Chernobyl happened, we must first understand the machine at heart, the RBMK 1000 reactor. RBMK stands for Reactor Bolshoi Mощnosti County, which translates to High Power Channel Type Reactor. These massive installations were uniquely Soviet in design, developed in the 1960s and 1970s as a USSR race to expand its nuclear energy capacity. By 1986, there were 17 RBMK reactors operating across the Soviet Union, with Chernobyl's Reactor 4 being one of the newest. The RBMK design had certain advantages that made it attractive to Soviet planners. Unlike Western reactors that use a single large pressure vessel, the RBMK utilized individual fuel channels, 1,661 of them in each reactor. This modular design meant that fuel could be replaced while the reactor was still operating, a significant advantage for maintaining continuous power generation. The reactors were also enormous, capable of producing 1,000 megawatts of electrical power, making them among the most powerful in the world. Perhaps most importantly for Soviet economics, RBMK reactors could be built relatively cheaply using materials and components that were readily available within the Soviet industrial system. But these advantages came with fatal flaws. The most dangerous was something called a positive void coefficient. In simple terms, this meant that if the water used to cool the reactor began to boil and form steam bubbles or voids, the nuclear reaction would actually speed up rather than slow down. This created a potentially runaway situation. Most Western reactor designs have a negative void coefficient. If the coolant starts to boil, the nuclear reaction automatically decreases, providing an inherent safety mechanism. The RBMK design worked in the opposite direction, meaning that any disruption in cooling could quickly spiral out of control. The second critical flaw involved the control rods themselves. These rods, made of boron carbide, were designed to absorb neutrons and slow or stop the nuclear reaction when fully inserted into the reactor core. However, Soviet engineers had made a catastrophic design choice. The control rods featured graphite tips, approximately 1 meter long, at their bottom ends. Graphite, unlike boron, actually accelerates nuclear reactions rather than slowing them. This meant that in the first few seconds after the emergency shutdown button was pressed, the graphite tips would enter the reactor core before the boron sections, briefly causing a surge in reactivity rather than a decrease. Under normal operating conditions, this design quirk posed little danger. But under abnormal conditions, precisely the conditions that would exist during an emergency, it could prove deadly. A third major weakness was the reactor's behavior at low power levels. RBMK reactors were designed to operate at high power, typically above 700 megawatts thermal. Operating below this level made the reactor extremely unstable and difficult to control. At low power, xenon-135, a neutron-absorbing isotope that forms as a byproduct of nuclear fission, begins to accumulate in the reactor core. This phenomenon, known as xenon poisoning, can cause power levels to drop even further, requiring operators to withdraw more control rods to compensate. The result is a reactor that becomes increasingly unstable and prone to sudden, uncontrollable power surges. Western nuclear experts were aware of some of these design flaws as early as the 1970s. But in the Soviet system, reactor design was classified information, and international cooperation on nuclear safety was limited by Cold War tensions. Soviet nuclear authorities themselves understood that RBMK reactors had safety issues, but these concerns were often downplayed or dismissed. The reactors had been operating for years without major incident, creating a false sense of security. Improvements and modifications were planned, but implemented slowly, if at all. The emphasis was on meeting production targets and expanding nuclear capacity, not on questioning the fundamental design of reactors that had already been built at considerable expense. This combination of design flaws created a ticking time bomb. All that was needed to set it off was the right, or rather, the wrong, set of circumstances. On the night of April 25, 1986, those circumstances would align with devastating precision. The Chernobyl disaster cannot be understood solely as a technical failure. It was equally a product of the Soviet political and social system, a culture where questioning authority could be dangerous, where admitting problems was seen as weakness, and where meeting targets mattered more than ensuring safety. To understand why experienced nuclear engineers made the decisions that led to the explosion, we must understand the environment in which they operated. The Soviet Union in the 1980s was a society built on hierarchy and central planning. Every aspect of the economy was controlled from Moscow, with production targets set by government planners and enforced through a rigid chain of command. Nuclear power was particularly important to Soviet prestige and economic planning. The USSR was in a race with the West to demonstrate the superiority of its technological capabilities, and nuclear energy was seen as a symbol of Soviet modernity and progress. Facilities like Chernobyl weren't just power plants. They were showcases of Soviet achievement. This political importance created immense pressure on plant workers and managers. Missing scheduled maintenance windows meant failing to meet electricity production targets, which could have serious professional consequences. Reporting safety concerns might be interpreted as attempting to excuse poor performance or, worse, as criticism of the Soviet system itself. In a society where political loyalty was paramount, technical objections could be seen as political defiance. The result was a culture where problems were often concealed rather than addressed, and where subordinates learned not to challenge their superiors. The hierarchical nature of Soviet society extended deep into the operational structure of nuclear facilities. Engineers and operators were trained to follow procedures and obey orders from their supervisors without question. Initiative and independent judgment, while technically valued, could be dangerous in practice if they led to conclusions that contradicted official positions or the demands of higher-ranking officials. This created a fundamental tension. Nuclear reactors require operators to make complex technical judgments and respond to unexpected situations. But the Soviet system had trained those same operators to defer to authority and avoid taking personal responsibility for difficult decisions. The cult of the expert was particularly strong in Soviet nuclear culture. Senior engineers like Anatoly Dyatlov had achieved their positions through years of service and demonstrated technical knowledge. They were regarded as authorities whose judgment should not be questioned, especially by younger or lower-ranking personnel. Dyatlov himself was known as a demanding and sometimes intimidating supervisor who did not welcome challenges to his decisions. On the night of the test, several younger operators expressed concerns about proceeding, but these concerns were dismissed. In the Soviet system, questioning a superior's judgment wasn't just professionally risky, it violated the fundamental social order. Secrecy compounded these problems. Information about previous nuclear incidents and safety issues was tightly controlled. Operators at Chernobyl may not have been fully informed about problems that had occurred at other RBMK reactors, limiting their ability to learn from others' mistakes. Even technical documentation was sometimes classified or restricted, making it difficult for operators to fully understand the systems they were managing. This culture of secrecy extended beyond nuclear facilities to Soviet society as a whole, where bad news was routinely suppressed and public discussion of problems was discouraged. The Soviet approach to safety reflected these cultural values. Safety protocols existed on paper, but they were often seen as flexible guidelines rather than absolute requirements. Meeting production schedules and demonstrating competence took precedence over strict adherence to safety procedures. There was an underlying assumption that experienced Soviet engineers could handle any situation through technical skill and improvisation. This attitude, a combination of overconfidence and institutional pressure, created an environment where cutting corners seemed acceptable, even routine. The night of April 25, 1986, would reveal the full cost of this culture. When operators needed to question their supervisors' decisions, they stayed silent. When safety rules conflicted with completing the test, the rules were ignored. When warning signs appeared, they were rationalized away. The Soviet system had created a perfect storm of institutional failure, and Reactor stood at its center. At the heart of the Chernobyl disaster stands one man whose decisions and demeanor would prove catastrophic: Anatoly Stepanovich Dyatlov. On the night of April 25, 1986, Dyatlov was the deputy chief engineer for operations at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, making him one of the most senior technical authorities on site. He was 54 years old, a veteran of the Soviet nuclear industry with decades of experience. It was his responsibility to supervise the safety tests being conducted on Reactor 4. The decisions he made that night would set in motion the worst nuclear accident in history. Dyatlov was born in 1931 and had spent his entire career in the Soviet nuclear program. He had worked on nuclear submarines and at various nuclear facilities before arriving at Chernobyl. By all accounts, he was highly intelligent and technically knowledgeable, the kind of expert the Soviet system valued and promoted. But Dyatlov also had a reputation for being difficult to work with. He was known as demanding, impatient, and sometimes openly contemptuous of subordinates he considered less competent. Former colleagues described him as someone who did not tolerate disagreement and who could be intimidating when challenged. On the night of the test, these personality traits would prove disastrous. Dyatlov arrived for the evening shift determined to complete the safety test before the scheduled reactor shutdown. The test had been postponed before, and there was institutional pressure to get it done. Delaying again would mean waiting months for the next opportunity, which would reflect poorly on the plant's management. For Dyatlov, failure to complete the test was not an option. From the beginning, things went wrong. The test was originally scheduled to begin in the afternoon of April 25th, but grid controllers in Kiev requested that the reactor continue generating electricity to meet demand. This delayed the start of the test by nearly 9 hours. By the time the reactor was ready to begin the power reduction for the test, it was late evening, and a new shift of operators had arrived, men who had not been present for the planning and were less familiar with the test procedures. As the power reduction began, further complications emerged. The reactor's power dropped too far, falling just 30 megawatts thermal instead of the planned 700, 1000 megawatts. This put the reactor into a highly unstable state. Xenon poison began to accumulate, further reducing reactivity and making the reactor even more difficult to control. According to safety regulations, the reactor should have been shut down immediately. Operating at such low power levels was strictly forbidden because of the instability it created. But Dyatlov insisted the test proceed. Junior operators, including Leonid Topchinov and Alexander Akimov, reportedly expressed concerns about continuing. They pointed out that the reactor was behaving abnormally and that they were violating safety procedures. Dyatlov dismissed their concerns. He later claimed that he believed the reactor could be safely controlled even under these conditions. Whether this was genuine confidence or simply refusal to acknowledge the danger remains debated. What is clear is that when subordinates questioned his judgment, Dyatlov responded with anger and insisted they follow his orders. To stabilize the reactor and raise power to a level where the test could proceed, operators withdrew most of the control rods from the core. This was another violation of safety rules, which required that at least 30 control rods remain fully inserted at all times to maintain control over the reactor. By the time they started the test, only 6 to 8 control rods remained fully inserted. The reactor was now in an extremely dangerous configuration, balanced on a knife's edge. Additional safety systems were disabled to conduct the test. The emergency core cooling system was shut off. Automatic shutdown mechanisms were overridden. Each of these actions, individually questionable, together created a situation where the reactor had virtually no safety margin. If anything went wrong, there would be no backup systems to prevent disaster. Dyatlov later defended his decisions, arguing that he had acted based on his understanding of the reactor's design and that he had no reason to believe catastrophe was imminent. But survivors in later investigations painted a different picture. A senior engineer so determined to complete his mission and so confident in his own judgment that he ignored multiple warning signs and overruled the concerns of his subordinates. In the Soviet hierarchy, Dyatlov's authority was absolute, and on that night, no one dared to stop him. By midnight on April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 at Chernobyl was in a precarious state. The safety test was finally ready to begin, but the reactor was operating far outside normal parameters. Power had been stabilized at approximately 200 megawatts thermal, still far below the safe operating range, but high enough that Anatoly Dyatlov had decided the test could proceed. In the control room, operators Alexander Akimov and Leonid Topchinov manned their stations, following Dyatlov's orders despite their reservations. What happened in the next 83 minutes would change the world. The test protocol was relatively straightforward in concept. The reactor's turbine would be disconnected from the electrical grid, allowing it to spin down freely. As the turbine's rotation slowed, engineers would measure how much electricity it could generate through this residual momentum. This electricity would be fed to the reactor's main cooling pumps to see if it could sustain them during the critical 60-second gap before backup diesel generators could fully activate. If successful, the test would demonstrate an additional safety margin for the reactor. If unsuccessful, they would simply record the data and shut down the reactor for its scheduled maintenance. At least, that was the plan. At 1:03 a.m., operators closed the steam valves to the turbine. This prevented steam from Reactor 4 from reaching Turbine 8, allowing it to begin its coast down. The test was now officially underway. As the turbine slowed, the electricity it generated decreased, causing the main circulation pumps to slow down as well. This was expected. However, the reduced flow of coolant to the reactor core meant that the water began to heat up more rapidly. Temperatures started to rise, with less water flowing to the core and higher temperatures. Steam formation increased dramatically. This is where the RBMK's fatal flaw came into play. The positive void coefficient meant that as more steam bubbles formed in the coolant channels, the nuclear reaction actually accelerated. Power began to rise. At 1:19 a.m., operators noticed the power increase. In the control room, alarm systems began to activate. The reactor was becoming unstable. Multiple indicators now showed that something was wrong. Pressure was increasing in the reactor's cooling system. The automatic control systems, struggling to manage the rising power, inserted and withdrew control rods rapidly. Computer printouts showed abnormal readings. But the test was still in progress, and stopping now would mean admitting failure. For 4 critical minutes, operators attempted to stabilize the reactor manually while continuing the test. At 1:23 and 4 seconds a.m., Senior Reactor Control Engineer Alexander Akimov made a fateful decision. Recognizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, he pressed the AZ5 button, the emergency shutdown switch. This was supposed to be the ultimate safety measure. When activated, AZ5 commanded all 211 control rods to fully insert into the reactor core, absorbing neutrons and halting the nuclear reaction. In a properly functioning reactor, this would bring the nuclear reaction to a safe stop within seconds. But as we discussed earlier, the RBMK's control rods had a deadly design flaw. The graphite tips at the bottom of each rod would enter the reactor core first, before the neutron-absorbing boron sections above them. For the first few seconds after AZ5 was pressed, instead of shutting down the reactor, the graphite tips actually increased reactivity in the lower part of the core. Under normal operating conditions, this brief spike in reactivity was insignificant and quickly overwhelmed by the boron sections. But Reactor 4 was not under normal operating conditions. The reactor was already in an unstable state, with most control rods withdrawn, excessive steam formation, and rising power. When the graphite tips entered the core, they triggered a massive power surge. Within seconds, thermal power shot up to an estimated 30,000 megawatts, more than 30 times the reactor's normal operating capacity. The fuel rods began to shatter from thermal shock. The intense heat caused the zirconium cladding around the fuel to react with steam, producing hydrogen gas. Pressure inside the reactor vessel rose catastrophically. At 1:23 and 40 seconds a.m., just 36 seconds after Akimov pressed the emergency shutdown button, operators in the control room heard a series of explosions. The first explosion, likely a steam explosion caused by superheated coolant flashing instantly to vapor, blew apart the fuel channels and ruptured the reactor vessel. A second explosion, possibly involving hydrogen or a direct nuclear excursion, followed almost immediately. The massive concrete and steel lid covering the reactor, weighing over 1,000 tons, was blown off and fell back at an angle into the reactor cavity. The reactor core was now exposed to the atmosphere. Debris rained down across the facility. Fires broke out immediately. The worst nuclear disaster in history had begun. The first people to witness the aftermath of the explosion were those who had been closest to it, the operators in Reactor 4's control room and workers elsewhere in the facility. What they saw defied comprehension. The building shook violently with the explosions. Lights flickered and went out. Dust and debris filled the air. In the control room, Alexander Akimov and Leonid Topchinov stared at their control panels in shock as readings showed impossible values. According to their instruments, the reactor core was gone, but senior plant managers, including Anatoly Dyatlov, initially refused to believe what had happened. Dyatlov, who had been supervising from a separate room, rushed to the control room and insisted that the reactor vessel must still be intact. He ordered Akimov and others to activate the emergency core cooling system. This command was futile. There was no reactor left to cool, but it reveals the psychological denial at work. The idea that an RBMK reactor could explode was so unthinkable within Soviet nuclear culture that even direct evidence was initially dismissed. Outside, the situation was catastrophic. The explosion had blown a massive hole in the roof of the reactor building. Radioactive debris had been scattered across the complex. Chunks of nuclear fuel, graphite moderator blocks, and contaminated metal littered the ground. Inside the exposed reactor core, the remaining graphite was burning, sending a plume of radioactive smoke into the night sky. The radiation levels were beyond measurement. The dosimeters available at the facility could only register up to 3.6 Roentgens per hour, and the needles were pinned at maximum. In reality, radiation near the destroyed reactor was thousands of Roentgens per hour, enough to deliver a lethal dose within minutes. 2 workers died almost immediately. Valery Kodomchuk, a pump operator, was in the reactor building when it exploded and was never found, his body presumably buried under the rubble. Vladimir Shashinok, a maintenance worker, suffered fatal injuries from the explosion and died hours later. But these would be far from the only casualties. The plant's firefighters responded within minutes. Lieutenant Vladimir Pripyat led the first crew to arrive on scene. What they encountered was unlike any fire they had trained for. The roof of the turbine hall was ablaze, with flames threatening to spread to Reactor 3, which was still operating in the adjacent building. Radioactive dust covered everything. The air itself was deadly, yet the firefighters had no idea they were dealing with a nuclear disaster. They had not been told about the radiation, and many had no protective equipment beyond their normal firefighting gear. For hours, firefighters battled the blaze. They climbed onto the burning roof, extinguishing flames and preventing the fire from spreading. Many handled highly radioactive graphite blocks with their bare hands, not knowing what they were. The radiation exposure they received was staggering. Lieutenant Pripyat and many of his men absorbed doses of 1,000 Roentgens or more, far beyond the lethal threshold. They continued fighting the fire even as they began experiencing symptoms of acute radiation sickness: nausea, vomiting, headaches, and a metallic taste in their mouths. By the time the fire was brought under control at around 5 a.m., many of these firefighters were effectively walking dead men. Inside the plant, operators and managers struggled to understand the scope of the disaster. Radiation readings that seemed impossible were dismissed as instrument errors. When workers sent to inspect the reactor reported that the core was destroyed, their reports were initially not believed. This denial extended up the chain of command. Plant Director Viktor Brukhanov initially reported to Moscow that the reactor was intact, though damaged, and that radiation levels were manageable. This information was false, but it reflected the Soviet culture of downplaying problems and the genuine difficulty of accepting that the unthinkable had occurred. As dawn broke on April 26, the full horror of the situation became undeniable. A pillar of radioactive smoke rose from the destroyed reactor, visible for kilometers. Radiation detectors in Pripyat, 3 kilometers away, were beginning to show elevated readings. In nearby villages, farmers noticed that the air had a strange smell and that animals were behaving oddly. But the official Soviet response remained muted. The government had not yet acknowledged that anything serious had happened. Residents of Pripyat went about their Saturday morning routines, unaware that they were being exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. Children played outside in parks that were now contaminated. It would be another 36 hours before evacuation orders were finally given. In those crucial first hours and days, the Soviet culture of secrecy and denial would claim countless additional victims. Pripyat in 1986 was a model Soviet city, built in 1970 specifically to house workers from the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and their families. It was a showcase of Soviet urban planning and modernity. The city had wide boulevards, modern apartment blocks, schools, hospitals, a cultural center, a swimming pool, and an amusement park that was scheduled to open on May 1st for the upcoming May Day celebrations. Nearly 50,000 people called Pripyat home, most of them young, with an average age of just 26 years. It was a place of optimism and prosperity, where workers in prestigious nuclear industry enjoyed a higher standard of living than most Soviet citizens. On the morning of April 26, 1986, all of that would begin to change forever. As Saturday morning dawned, most residents of Pripyat were unaware that anything was wrong. The explosions at Reactor had occurred in the middle of the night, and while some people had heard or seen the commotion, official announcements were not forthcoming. Throughout the day, life continued in eerie normalcy. Children played outside. People went shopping. Couples strolled along the Pripyat River. A wedding took place. The new amusement park stood ready for its grand opening in just days. Yet invisible radiation was already blanketing the city. Some residents noticed strange things. There was an unusual number of military vehicles and emergency personnel moving through the streets. People reported a metallic taste in their mouths and feelings of nausea. Domestic animals behaved strangely, and birds seemed agitated. But without official information, most people assumed these were minor issues related to some kind of accident at the plant. The Soviet authorities had a long tradition of controlling information, and citizens were conditioned not to panic or spread rumors. Behind the scenes, a different reality was unfolding. Soviet officials were beginning to grasp the scale of the disaster, though even they did not yet fully understand the extent of the radiation release. Radiation measurements in Pripyat were rising throughout the day. By evening, levels in some parts of the city were hundreds of times above normal background radiation. A government commission had been established and was traveling to Chernobyl to assess the situation. The question of whether to evacuate Pripyat was being debated. Evacuation presented enormous logistical and political challenges. Moving 50,000 people required hundreds of buses and significant planning. More importantly, a large-scale evacuation would acknowledge the severity of the accident, which the Soviet government was reluctant to do. There were also genuine uncertainties about whether evacuation was necessary. Some officials argued that people could remain in their homes if they stayed indoors and followed precautions. Others recognized that the radiation levels were far too high for any prolonged exposure to be safe. As is often the case in large bureaucracies, particularly Soviet ones, decisions were delayed by debate, hierarchy, and a desire to avoid taking responsibility. Finally, on April 27th, more than 36 hours after the explosion, the decision was made. Pripyat would be evacuated. At 2 p.m., the city's public address system crackled to life. An announcement informed residents that due to an accident at the power plant, a temporary evacuation was being conducted. Citizens were told to take only essential items, documents, some food, clothing for a few days. They were assured that the evacuation was temporary and that they would be able to return soon. This was a lie, though officials may not have fully realized it at the time. The residents of Pripyat would never come home. Over the next 3 hours, an extraordinary exodus took place. Over 1,200 buses streamed into Pripyat in a convoy that stretched for kilometers. Each bus was assigned a specific address and filled with evacuees. The operation was conducted with impressive Soviet efficiency. By 5 p.m., the city was virtually empty. Apartments still had food on tables and clothes in closets. Toys lay where children had dropped them. The Ferris wheel in the amusement park, painted in bright yellow, stood silent, never having carried a single passenger. The evacuees were taken to nearby towns and cities, where they were housed temporarily in schools, hotels, and private homes. Many believed they would return within days. As weeks passed and they remained displaced, the reality slowly set in. Pripyat was a ghost city now, too contaminated for human habitation. The exclusion zone would eventually be expanded to encompass an area of approximately 2,600 square kilometers, displacing over 350,000 people from hundreds of towns and villages. But Pripyat, the city built to serve Chernobyl, would remain the most potent symbol of what had been lost. Frozen in time, it stands today as a monument to the disaster. A modern city abandoned overnight, its playgrounds empty, its schools silent, its streets overgrown with trees. The home that 50,000 people left for just a few days in April 1986 has remained empty for nearly 4 decades. In the days and weeks following the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet government mobilized an unprecedented response to contain the catastrophe. Over the next several months, hundreds of thousands of people, soldiers, firefighters, miners, engineers, doctors, and workers from across the Soviet Union, would be sent to Chernobyl to fight a war against radiation. They would be known as the liquidators, and their sacrifice would prevent an even greater catastrophe while exposing them to dangers that many did not fully understand. The immediate priority was stopping the graphite fire burning in the exposed reactor core. For 10 days after the explosion, the graphite continued to burn, sending radioactive smoke into the atmosphere. The smoke plume was visible for kilometers and was spreading radiation across Ukraine and Belarus and beyond. Soviet military helicopters began flying over the reactor, dropping bags of sand, boron, lead, and clay in an attempt to smother the fire and absorb radiation. It was extraordinarily dangerous work. The helicopter crews flew through clouds of radioactive smoke, absorbing significant radiation doses with each pass. One helicopter reportedly crashed after its rotors hit a construction crane, killing the crew. By May 6th, approximately 5,000 tons of material had been dropped onto the reactor. The fire gradually subsided, though the reactor core will remain dangerously hot for weeks. But the graphite fire was only one of multiple urgent threats. Below the destroyed reactor, the massive concrete pad that formed the building's foundation was in danger. Molten nuclear fuel, mixed with melted concrete and metal, was burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. This corium, a lava-like radioactive substance, was slowly burning through floors and threatening to reach the water-filled basement beneath the reactor. If the molten fuel contacted the water, the resulting steam explosion could be catastrophic, potentially destroying the remaining 3 reactors at Chernobyl and releasing even more radioactivity. To prevent this, the water had to be drained from the basement. This meant someone had to enter the highly contaminated building, navigate through flooded and radioactive corridors, and manually open drainage valves. 3 plant workers, engineers Alexei Ananenko and Valery Bespalov, along with shift supervisor Boris Baranov, volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission. Wearing wetsuits and equipped with minimal radiation protection, they dove into the radioactive water and successfully opened the valves, draining the basement. Remarkably, all 3 men survived, though they absorbed significant radiation doses. Their bravery potentially prevented a second explosion that could have made vast areas of Europe uninhabitable. The next challenge was preventing the molten fuel from burning to the concrete pad entirely. Soviet authorities decided to excavate a tunnel beneath the reactor and construct a massive cooling system to freeze the ground underneath. This required digging through highly radioactive soil directly beneath the epicenter of the disaster. Coal miners from across Ukraine were recruited for the task. They worked in brutal conditions: extreme heat, high humidity, constant radiation exposure, and cramped spaces. Many worked without proper protective equipment because it was too hot or too restrictive for the physical labor required. They excavated the tunnel in just 34 days, an astonishing feat of human endurance. Though the cooling system they installed was never fully utilized because the fuel eventually cooled on its own, their effort demonstrated extraordinary courage. Meanwhile, the massive task of decontaminating the surrounding area had begun. Thousands of soldiers and civilian workers were deployed to clean radioactive debris from roofs, roads, and contaminated areas. The most dangerous work was clearing the debris from the roof of Reactor 3, which adjoined the destroyed Reactor 4. This debris, chunks of graphite and fuel from the reactor core, was so radioactive that exposure for even a few minutes could be fatal. Remote control robots were initially used, but many failed in the intense radiation field. Ultimately, humans had to do the work. These workers, called biorobots, would run onto the roof, shovel debris into the reactor hall below, and then rush back to shelter. Each person could only work for 40 to 90 seconds before reaching their maximum allowable radiation dose. Hundreds of men made these runs, each one exposing themselves to radiation levels that would cause long-term health effects. It was brutal, dangerous work, but it was essential to allow construction of a protective shelter over the destroyed reactor. In total, estimates suggest that between 600,000 and 800,000 people served as liquidators during the cleanup operations that continued for years. They came from all walks of life and all corners of the Soviet Union. Many were not fully informed about the dangers they faced. Some volunteered out of patriotic duty. Others were conscripted. The government promised special benefits and recognition, though many liquidators report these promises were not honored. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of liquidators have died prematurely from cancers and other radiation-related illnesses. Tens of thousands more suffer from chronic health problems. Yet without their sacrifice, the Chernobyl disaster would have been far worse. They were heroes and victims simultaneously. People who gave their health and often their lives to contain a catastrophe that should never have happened. With the immediate crisis stabilized by early summer 1986, Soviet authorities faced a daunting question: what to do with the destroyed Reactor 4. The reactor core remained intensely radioactive and would continue to pose a deadly threat for thousands of years. Simply leaving it exposed was not an option. Wind and rain would continue spreading contamination across Europe. The solution that emerged was both ambitious and desperate: build a massive concrete and steel structure to completely encase the destroyed reactor, isolating it from the environment. This structure would become known as the sarcophagus, and its construction would become one of the most challenging engineering projects ever attempted. The design requirements were unprecedented. The structure needed to be large enough to cover the entire destroyed reactor building, including the gaping hole blown in its roof. It had to be strong enough to withstand Ukrainian winters and summer heat for decades. Most challenging of all, it had to be constructed in one of the most radioactive places on Earth, where workers could only spend minutes at a time before reaching dangerous exposure levels. Traditional construction methods were impossible. Every aspect of the project had to be redesigned to minimize human radiation exposure. Soviet engineers developed an ingenious approach. Rather than building the sarcophagus directly over the reactor, which would require workers to operate in the most radioactive areas, they decided to construct it in sections adjacent to the reactor and then slide or lift these sections into place. Two massive structures were built on either side of the destroyed reactor hall. The western structure, called Cascade Wall, and the eastern structure, known as the engine room wall, would serve as the primary supports. Between them, a complex framework of steel beams would be installed to support the roof. Construction began in June 1986 and proceeded at a frantic pace. Soviet authorities wanted the sarcophagus completed before winter, when freezing temperatures would make construction even more difficult. Thousands of workers, construction workers, welders, crane operators, and engineers, were mobilized. They worked in shifts measured in minutes rather than hours. A worker might climb up to a beam, perform a few welds, and then have to retreat because his radiation dosimeter indicated he had reached his limit. Another worker would then take his place, continuing where he left off. It was construction by relay, with hundreds of workers each contributing small pieces to the overall structure. Remote-controlled equipment was used wherever possible. Cranes operated by workers stationed in lead-line cabins lifted steel beams weighing dozens of tons into position. Concrete was pumped through long hoses that kept workers at a safer distance. But much of the work still required human hands. Welders had to climb onto steel frameworks high above the ground to join beams together. Concrete finishers had to ensure proper placement and curing. Electricians had to install lighting and ventilation systems. Each task meant radiation exposure for the workers involved. The roof structure was particularly challenging. It needed to span approximately 70 meters across the reactor hall while supporting its own considerable weight, plus the weight of metal panels that would cover it. Engineers designed a complex tubular steel framework, essentially a giant steel tent, that was assembled on the ground and then lifted into place using hydraulic jacks. The operation took weeks and required precise coordination. As sections of the roof were raised, workers rushed into weld support connections before radiation forced them to retreat. By November 1986, just 7 months after the disaster, the sarcophagus was essentially complete. Over 400,000 cubic meters of concrete and 7,000 tons of steel had been used in its construction. The structure enclosed a destroyed reactor in a shell that measured approximately 66 meters wide, 160 meters long, and stood over 50 meters tall. It was an extraordinary achievement accomplished under almost impossible conditions. But the sarcophagus was never intended to be a permanent solution. Built hastily under emergency conditions, it had significant structural weaknesses. The roof was not fully waterproof, allowing rain and snow to enter and potentially spread contamination. The structure was not anchored to a proper foundation, raising concerns about stability. Most worrying, the massive metal framework was gradually corroding in the harsh Ukrainian climate. Engineers estimated the sarcophagus will remain stable for perhaps 20 to 30 years. After that, it might collapse, potentially releasing radioactive dust and exposing the reactor core once again. Inside the sarcophagus, approximately 200 tons of radioactive material remained. The remnants of Reactor 4's nuclear fuel mixed with melted concrete, steel, and other materials. This mass would remain dangerously radioactive for tens of thousands of years. The sarcophagus had bought time, but it was only a temporary bandage on a wound that would never fully heal. The question of what to do for the long term would haunt Chernobyl for decades to come. While Soviet authorities struggled to contain the disaster at Chernobyl itself, the radioactive plume from the destroyed reactor was already spreading across Europe. The explosion and subsequent fire had released enormous quantities of radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere. Prevailing winds carried this contamination north and west, creating an invisible threat that would eventually affect dozens of countries and hundreds of millions of people. The international dimensions of the Chernobyl disaster would expose the limitations of Soviet secrecy and force a global reckoning with nuclear safety. The first hint that something catastrophic had occurred came not from the Soviet Union, but from Sweden. On the morning of April 28, 1986, 2 days after the explosion, workers at the Forsmark nuclear power plant, located about 110 kilometers north of Stockholm, triggered radiation alarms when they arrived for their shifts. Their clothing was contaminated with radioactive particles. Initially, Swedish authorities feared there had been an accident at Forsmark itself, but investigations quickly revealed that the radiation was coming from outside the plant. It was being blown in on the wind from somewhere to the southeast. Within hours, radiation detectors across Scandinavia were reporting elevated levels. Denmark, Finland, and Norway all detected the contamination. Scientists analyzed the radioactive isotopes and determined they were consistent with nuclear reactor accident, not a weapons test. The pattern of contamination and wind directions pointed toward the Soviet Union. Swedish diplomats contacted Soviet authorities demanding information. Initially, the Soviets denied that anything had happened. This stonewalling would continue for crucial hours even as evidence mounted. Finally, on the evening of April 28th, Soviet state television broadcast a brief announcement. An accident had occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Measures were being taken to address the consequences. Assistance was being provided to those affected. That was all. No details about the scale of the disaster, no acknowledgement of the radiation spreading across Europe, no information about what had caused the accident. It was classic Soviet crisis management. Acknowledge only what could no longer be denied, minimize the severity, and provide no information that might suggest systemic failures. But by this point, the international community was mobilizing its own response. Radiation monitoring stations across Europe were tracking the plume's movement. The contamination spread in a complex pattern depending on wind direction and rainfall. Areas of Belarus and Ukraine closest to Chernobyl received the heaviest contamination. But significant radioactive deposits also fell on parts of Russia, Poland, the Baltic states, Scandinavia, and even regions of Central and Western Europe. The radioactive isotopes released included iodine, 131, cesium, 137, strontium, 90, and plutonium, 239, among others. Each posed different health risks. Iodine 131, with a half-life of just 8 days, would decay relatively quickly but was immediately dangerous because it concentrates in the thyroid gland, particularly in children. Cesium 137, with a half-life of 30 years, would contaminate soil and enter the food chain for decades. Strontium 90, another long-lived isotope, mimics calcium and accumulates in bones. Plutonium 239 would remain dangerous for thousands of years. European governments scrambled to protect their populations. Poland, acting quickly, distributed potassium iodide tablets to children. These tablets flood the thyroid with non-radioactive iodine, preventing the absorption of radioactive iodine, 131. This prophylactic measure would prove highly effective in reducing thyroid cancer rates in Poland compared to neighboring countries that did not take similar action. Other countries issued advisories about contaminated food. Fresh milk was a particular concern because cows grazing on contaminated grass would concentrate radioactive iodine in their milk. Many countries temporarily banned the sale of fresh milk and leafy vegetables. In some areas, the contamination was severe enough to require long-term countermeasures. Parts of Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom experienced significant cesium deposition. In areas of Wales and Cumbria in the UK, sheep farming was effective for years because the animals grazed on contaminated hillsides. Restrictions on moving or selling these sheep remained in place for decades. In Bavaria, Germany, wild mushrooms and game meat remained contaminated for years. The forests acted as sinks for radioactive cesium, which would cycle through the ecosystem for generations. The international response to Chernobyl highlighted the transboundary nature of nuclear accidents. Radioactive contamination does not respect national borders. One country's nuclear disaster becomes the world's problem. This realization prompted calls for greater international cooperation on nuclear safety and for binding requirements that countries immediately notify neighbors of nuclear accidents. Later in 1986, the International Atomic Energy Agency would establish a convention on early notification of a nuclear accident and the Convention on Assistance in the case of a nuclear accident, both direct responses to the failures of international communication during Chernobyl. The radioactive clouds from Chernobyl traveled thousands of kilometers from the accident site, a stark reminder that in the nuclear age, disasters have global implications. Decades later, traces of Chernobyl's fallout can still be detected in European soils, a permanent legacy of that April night when a reactor exploded and contaminated a continent. The Chernobyl disaster exposed one of the fundamental characteristics of the Soviet system, an institutional preference for secrecy and denial over transparency and accountability. From the first moments after the explosion to the months that followed, Soviet authorities consistently downplayed the severity of the accident, withheld critical information from both their own citizens and the international community, and prioritized political considerations over public safety. This pattern of cover-up and denial would have profound consequences for the health of exposed populations and for the credibility of the Soviet government itself. The cover-up began immediately after the explosion. As we've seen, Plant Director Viktor Burkhanov initially reported to Moscow that the reactor was damaged but intact. This assessment was either willfully dishonest or represented such profound denial that it amounted to the same thing. Throughout April 26th and into April 27th, as radiation spread across Pripyat and the surrounding region, Soviet authorities made no public announcement and took no immediate steps to protect the population. Children continued playing outside. People went to work. Contaminated milk was consumed. Each hour delay meant additional radiation exposure for thousands of people. Even after the evacuation of Pripyat on April 27th, Soviet authorities continued to minimize the disaster. The first official Soviet announcement, broadcast on the evening of April 28th after Sweden had forced the issue by detecting radiation, consisted of a single sentence acknowledging that an accident had occurred. It provided no details about casualties, no information about radiation releases, and no acknowledgement that the accident posed any threat beyond the immediate vicinity of the plant. This brief statement was clearly intended to satisfy international pressure while revealing as little as possible. The Soviet government's internal response reflected similar priorities. Mikhail Gorbachev, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, was reportedly not fully briefed on the severity of the disaster until days after it occurred. Lower-level officials, conditioned by decades of Soviet practice, had filtered and minimized the information as it moved up the chain of command. Each level of bureaucracy reported only what it thought its superiors wanted to hear, creating a fog of misinformation that obscured the true scope of the catastrophe. When Gorbachev finally understood what had happened, he was reportedly furious at having been misled. But even as the Soviet leadership came to grasp the reality of Chernobyl, their public communications remained evasive. Throughout May 1986, as liquidators fought to contain the disaster and radiation continued to spread, Soviet media provided only limited information. Reports emphasized the heroism of workers and the government's decisive response while downplaying the radiation risks and health consequences. International criticism was dismissed as anti-Soviet propaganda. When Western scientists estimated that thousands might eventually die from radiation-induced cancers, Soviet officials angrily rejected these projections as politically motivated. The cover-up extended to the treatment of those exposed to radiation. Firefighters and plant workers who had received massive radiation doses in the first hours after the explosion were taken to Hospital Number 6 in Moscow, a specialized facility for treating radiation injuries. The hospital was placed under strict security. Families were given limited access to patients. Information about the victims' conditions was tightly controlled. When 28 people died from acute radiation sickness in the weeks following the accident, their deaths were acknowledged but details were suppressed. The bodies of those who died were so radioactive that they were buried in lead coffins in sealed concrete vaults. Yet even this extraordinary precaution was not publicly discussed at the time. Perhaps most damaging was the Soviet government's failure to honestly address the long-term health risks facing exposed populations. Hundreds of thousands of people in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia had received significant radiation doses. Studies of atomic bomb survivors and other radiation-exposed populations suggested that increased cancer rates, particularly thyroid cancer in children, were likely, yet Soviet health authorities consistently downplayed these risks. Doctors who attempted to link health problems to radiation exposure faced professional consequences. Data on radiation doses and health outcomes was classified. This denial of medical reality would have lasting consequences for public health and for trust in Soviet institutions. The cover-up also affected the investigation into what had caused the disaster. Initial Soviet reports to the International Atomic Energy Agency placed blame primarily on the operators, particularly Anatoly Dyatlov and his subordinates. The RBMK reactor design was defended as fundamentally sound. It was not until years later, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, that the full extent of the reactor's design flaws was officially acknowledged. This delay in confronting the technical failures meant that other RBMK reactors continued operating with the same dangerous characteristics that had destroyed Reactor 4. The Chernobyl cover-up ultimately failed. The radiation released by the disaster was too widespread to hide. International monitoring made continued denial impossible. As the Soviet Union entered its final years under Gorbachev's policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring, the culture of secrecy that had characterized the Chernobyl response came under increasing criticism. For many Soviet citizens, Chernobyl became a symbol of everything wrong with their system. The lies, the incompetence, the prioritization of political considerations over human welfare. The disaster and its cover-up contributed to the erosion of public faith in Soviet institutions that would culminate in the USSR's collapse just 5 years later. Determining the true human cost of the Chernobyl disaster remains one of the most controversial aspects of the accident. The immediate deaths are well documented. 2 killed instantly in the explosion, 28 dying from acute radiation sickness within weeks, and perhaps a dozen more deaths among emergency workers in the months that followed. But the long-term health consequences, the cancers, genetic effects, and other radiation-induced illnesses that would emerge over decades, are far more difficult to quantify and have become the subject of intense scientific and political debate. The firefighters and plant workers who responded in the first hours after the explosion faced the most extreme radiation exposures. Many received doses exceeding 6 grade GY, far above the level considered lethal. These men experienced the full horror of acute radiation syndrome. In the first hours and days, they suffered nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Their skin reddened and blistered. As days passed, their bone marrow failed, leaving them unable to produce new blood cells. Their immune systems collapsed, leaving them vulnerable to infections. Their gastrointestinal tracts broke down. Many fell into comas. The medical staff at Hospital Number 6 in Moscow worked desperately to save them, attempting bone marrow transplants and other experimental treatments. But for most, the radiation damage was too severe. They died in agony, their bodies destroyed from within by radiation. Beyond these immediate victims, hundreds of thousands of liquidators received lower, but still significant radiation doses during cleanup operations. While few received immediately lethal exposures, many absorbed enough radiation to increase their long-term cancer risk. Studies of liquidator populations have found elevated rates of leukemia and other cancers compared to unexposed populations. Estimates suggest that thousands of liquidators have died prematurely from radiation-induced illnesses, though exact numbers remain disputed. The most clear-cut long-term health effect has been the dramatic increase in thyroid cancer among children exposed to radioactive iodine. In the years following the accident, rates of childhood thyroid cancer in Belarus, Ukraine, and affected areas of Russia increased dramatically, in some regions by factors of tens or even hundreds compared to pre-accident rates. By the early 2000s, over 5,000 cases of thyroid cancer had been diagnosed among people who were children or adolescents at the time of the accident. Fortunately, thyroid cancer is often treatable, and the survival rate has been high, but the disease requires lifelong medical management, and it profoundly affected thousands of lives. The question of other cancers attributable to Chernobyl is more contentious. Radiation exposure is known to increase cancer risk across many organ systems. However, cancer is also common in unexposed populations, making it statistically difficult to detect small increases in cancer rates against a background rate. Different organizations have produced widely varying estimates of Chernobyl's ultimate death toll. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effect of Atomic Radiation, UNSCR, has been relatively conservative, suggesting that while increased cancer rates are expected, they may be too small to detect epidemiologically in most exposed populations. Other organizations, including some radiation protection agencies and advocacy groups, have projected much higher death tolls, sometimes estimating tens of thousands of eventual cancer deaths. Part of the difficulty in assessing health impact stems from the nature of radiation-induced cancer. There is typically a latency period of years or decades between exposure and disease. A person exposed as a child in 1986 might not develop leukemia until the 1990s or solid tumors until the 2010s or 2020s. This long delay makes it difficult to definitively link individual cancers to Chernobyl exposure, especially for people who received relatively low doses. Moreover, cancer rates are influenced by many factors beyond radiation. Smoking, diet, other environmental exposures, genetics, and changes in medical screening practices all affect cancer statistics. The psychological and social impacts of Chernobyl have been profound but difficult to quantify. Hundreds of thousands of people were permanently displaced from their homes. Communities were destroyed. Families were separated. People living in contaminated areas face uncertainty about their health and their futures. Studies have found elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress among affected populations. Some researchers argue that these psychological effects have been more damaging to overall public health than the direct radiation effects for most of the exposed population. Economic impacts have also been enormous. Belarus alone is estimated to have spent billions of dollars on Chernobyl-related expenses, cleanup, resettlement, medical care, and compensation for affected populations. Vast areas of productive agricultural land remain contaminated and unusable. The regional economy was devastated. The continuing costs of managing the Chernobyl site and maintaining the exclusion zone represent an ongoing burden. Perhaps most tragically, much of this suffering was preventable. If the reactor had been properly designed, if safety culture had been prioritized, if the tests had been conducted correctly or halted when problems arose, if evacuation had begun promptly, if potassium iodide had been distributed quickly. Each of these failures represented a missed opportunity to prevent or reduce human suffering. The human toll of Chernobyl thus represents not just the physical effects of radiation, but the cumulative cost of systemic failures, poor decisions, and misplaced priorities. The explosion at Reactor 4 released approximately 400 times more radioactive material than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. This massive release contaminated not just the immediate area around the plant, but vast regions of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, along with parts of Europe. The environmental consequences would transform ecosystems, render agricultural land unusable, and create an exclusion zone that would persist for generations. Chernobyl became the most significant radiological contamination event in human history, and its environmental legacy continues to this day. The most heavily contaminated area is the 30-kilometer exclusion zone surrounding the plant. Within this zone, radiation levels remain dangerously high in many locations. The most contaminated areas, particularly the Red Forest, a stand of pine trees that turned reddish-brown and died after absorbing massive radiation doses, are still so radioactive that even brief visits are dangerous. The trees were eventually bulldozed and buried, but the site remains highly contaminated. Throughout the exclusion zone, soil contamination varies dramatically depending on rainfall patterns on the day of the accident and the days that followed. Some areas received heavy deposits of cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium-239, isotopes that will remain hazardous for decades to centuries. Beyond the exclusion zone, significant contamination extends across much larger areas. Approximately 150,000 square kilometers, an area roughly the size of England, received cesium-137 contamination, exceeding 37 kilobecquerels per square meter, the level at which land is considered contaminated. Much of this land is in Belarus, which received about 60% of the fallout despite being smaller than Ukraine. The pattern of contamination was highly uneven, with some areas receiving heavy deposits while nearby locations remained relatively clean, depending on when and where rain fell during the passage of the radioactive plume. Agricultural land was particularly affected. Cesium-137 and strontium-90 contaminate crops, entering the food chain and concentrating in milk and meat. In heavily contaminated areas, agriculture became impossible. In less contaminated regions, restrictions were placed on what could be grown and sold. Dairy farming was especially problematic because cows grazing on contaminated grass would concentrate radioactive cesium in their milk. Decades later, wild mushrooms, berries, and game meat from forests in contaminated regions still contain levels of cesium-137 high enough to pose health risks. Forests act as long-term reservoirs for radioactive contamination, with cesium cycling through the ecosystem in a process that will continue for generations. Water systems were also contaminated. The Pripyat River, which flows through the exclusion zone, carried radioactive material downstream. Lake systems in Belarus accumulated contamination. Fish from contaminated waters concentrate cesium in their flesh, making them unsafe to eat. Even today, fishing is restricted in many water bodies in the affected region. Groundwater contamination remains a concern, as radioactive material slowly leaches from soil into aquifers. Paradoxically, the exclusion zone has become an unintentional nature preserve. With humans absent, wildlife populations have flourished. Wolves, deer, wild boar, lynx, and even rare species like Przewalski's horses now roam the abandoned landscape. Bird populations have thrived. The forests have grown thick and wild without human management. This has led some to characterize the zone as an example of nature's resilience and ability to recover even after catastrophic contamination. However, this optimistic view requires careful qualification. While wildlife populations are abundant, individual animals may suffer genetic damage and health effects from chronic radiation exposure. Studies have found elevated mutation rates in some species. Some research suggests reduced lifespans and reproductive success in highly contaminated areas. The apparent thriving of wildlife may reflect not the harmlessness of radiation, but rather the fact that the absence of humans provides greater benefits to wildlife populations than the harm caused by radiation. In other words, humans are worse for wildlife than radioactive contamination. The contamination is not static. Wildfires in the exclusion zone remain a significant concern because they can resuspend radioactive particles from soil and vegetation, spreading contamination again. Several major fires have occurred over the years, requiring emergency response to prevent radioactive smoke from reaching populated areas. Climate change and forest management issues may increase fire risk in the future. The site of Reactor 4 itself remains intensely radioactive. The sarcophagus built in 1986 was always intended as a temporary measure, and by the 2010s it was deteriorating. In 2016, the new safe confinement, a massive steel arch structure built adjacent to Reactor and then slid into place over the sarcophagus, was completed. This structure is designed to last 100 years and will eventually allow for the dismantlement of the original sarcophagus and the removal of the radioactive material inside. But this work will take decades and represents one of the most challenging engineering projects ever attempted. The environmental legacy of Chernobyl is measured not just in contaminated soil and water, but in the transformation of human relationship with an entire region. A landscape that was once home to hundreds of thousands of people where fields were cultivated and cities thrived, has been rendered largely uninhabitable for human timescales. It stands as a monument to the catastrophic environmental consequences of nuclear accidents and to the immense challenge of managing their aftermath. In the aftermath of any disaster, there is an inevitable search for accountability. Who was responsible? What laws were broken? Who should be punished? The Chernobyl disaster presented particular challenges for this process because responsibility was distributed across multiple levels. Reactor designers, plant management, operators, safety regulators, and the Soviet system itself all played roles in creating conditions for catastrophe. Nevertheless, Soviet authorities determined that someone must be held criminally accountable, and in July 1987, 6 men stood trial in the town of Chernobyl for their roles in the disaster. The trial was, in many ways, a typically Soviet proceeding. It took place not in an open courtroom, but in the Palace of Culture in Pripyat, or rather, what had been Pripyat before evacuation. The location was symbolic, but also practical. Holding the trial in the abandoned city served as a constant reminder of what had been lost. The proceedings were conducted largely in secret, with limited information released to the public. The outcome was never really in doubt. This was not a trial designed to explore systemic failures or to question reactor design or regulatory oversight. It was designed to assign blame to individuals. The 6 defendants represented different levels of the plant's management and operations. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer who supervised the fatal test, was the most prominent defendant. Viktor Brukhanov, the plant director, was charged with failures of management and oversight. Nikolai Fomin, the chief engineer, faced similar charges. 3 other individuals, shift supervisor Boris Rogozhin, inspector Yuri Loshkin, and safety chief Alexander Kovalenko, were also prosecuted. Notably absent from the defendant's dock were reactor designers, officials from the Soviet nuclear regulatory body, or higher-level authorities who had approved the test procedures. The prosecution's case focused heavily on the operators' violations of safety procedures. The litany of violations was indeed substantial. The reactor had been operated at dangerously low power levels in violation of regulations. Most control rods had been withdrawn, leaving the reactor in an unstable configuration. Safety systems had been disabled. The test had proceeded despite multiple warning signs. The prosecution argued that these violations, particularly those made under Dyatlov's supervision, directly caused the explosion. Dyatlov mounted a vigorous defense. He argued that he had acted based on his understanding of the reactor's design, and that he had no reason to believe that the conditions existing during the test would lead to an explosion. More significantly, he began to point toward the reactor design itself as a root cause. The positive void coefficient, the control rod design flaw, the reactor's instability at low power, these were design features, not operator errors. Dyatlov argued that he and his colleagues were being scapegoated for fundamental flaws in the RBMK reactor that were the responsibility of the reactor's designers, not its operators. This line of argument was politically problematic for Soviet authorities. Acknowledging design flaws in the RBMK reactor would mean admitting that 17 other RBMK reactors operating across the Soviet Union shared these flaws. It would require expensive modifications. It would acknowledge that Soviet reactor design was fundamentally flawed, undermining confidence in Soviet technology. It was far simpler to blame the operators. The trial concluded in July 1987 with guilty verdicts for all 6 defendants. Dyatlov received the harshest sentence, 10 years in a labor camp. Brukhanov and Fomin each received 10-year sentences as well. The other defendants received shorter sentences. In a characteristically Soviet touch, the sentences were later reduced, and most of the convicted men were released early. Dyatlov served about 5 years before being released due to deteriorating health from radiation exposure. He would spend his remaining years writing his account of the disaster and arguing that the trial had been a miscarriage of justice. In many ways, Dyatlov was both guilty and a scapegoat. His decisions on the night of the accident were indeed reckless and violated safety protocols. His authoritarian management style prevented subordinates from halting the test when problems emerged. In this sense, he bore personal responsibility for the disaster. But he was also correct that the reactor design was fundamentally flawed, and that these flaws were not his responsibility. a trial that focused solely on operator error, while ignoring design failures and systemic issues, could not deliver complete justice. Over the years following the trial, as the Soviet Union collapsed and more information became available, the scientific consensus shifted toward recognizing the reactor design flaws as primary contributing factors. A 1991 report by the International Atomic Energy Agency concluded that while operator actions contributed to the accident, the reactor design was the major factor in causing the accident. This vindicated Dyatlov's defense in some respects, though it did not absolve him of responsibility for his reckless decisions. The question of accountability for Chernobyl extends far beyond the 6 men who stood trial. The disaster was enabled by a system that prioritized production over safety, that discouraged questioning of authority, that maintained secrecy rather than sharing safety information, and that built fundamentally flawed reactors without adequate safety analysis. True accountability would have required examining and reforming this entire system. Instead, the Soviet government held a limited trial of convenient scapegoats, obtained guilty verdicts, and moved on without fundamental reforms. It was a pattern that reflected the institutional failures that had caused Chernobyl in the first place. Nearly 4 decades after the explosion at Reactor 4, the Chernobyl disaster continues to cast a long shadow over the nuclear industry, environmental policy, and our understanding of technological risk. The disaster's legacy is complex, encompassing not just the direct consequences of the accident itself, but also what it revealed about human decision-making, institutional culture, and the challenges of managing powerful technologies. Perhaps most importantly, Chernobyl stands as an enduring example of what happens when no one dares to question a decision that everyone suspects might be wrong. The immediate impact on the nuclear industry was profound. In the years following Chernobyl, planned nuclear power plants were canceled across Europe and North America. Public opposition to nuclear energy intensified. Countries like Italy held referendums and decided to abandon nuclear power entirely. The disaster seemed to confirm the fears of anti-nuclear activists and raise fundamental questions about whether the technology could ever be operated safely. While some countries, particularly France, continued robust nuclear programs, the global expansion of nuclear power was significantly slowed by Chernobyl. For the Soviet Union, Chernobyl had even more fundamental consequences. The disaster occurred just as Mikhail Gorbachev was attempting to reform Soviet society through his policies of glasnost and perestroika. The initial cover-up and denial following the accident contradicted Gorbachev's calls for openness and transparency. As information about the disaster scale gradually emerged, it shattered public confidence in Soviet institutions. If the government had lied about Chernobyl, what else had it lied about? The disaster became a symbol of Soviet failure and contributed to the loss of legitimacy that would culminate in the USSR's collapse in 1991. The nuclear industry learned specific technical lessons from Chernobyl. The remaining RBMK reactors were extensively modified to address the design flaws that had contributed to the disaster. The control rod design was fixed. Additional safety systems were installed. Operating procedures were revised. Beyond RBMK reactors specifically, the accident prompted a global reassessment of nuclear safety culture. The concept of safety culture, the idea that safety must be prioritized at every level of an organization, from management to operations, became central to nuclear industry practice. The accident demonstrated that technical safeguards alone are insufficient if the organizational culture does not support their proper use. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Chernobyl concerns human decision-making under pressure. The disaster was not caused by a single catastrophic failure, but by a cascade of poor decisions made by people who were under institutional pressure, who were overconfident in their expertise, and who were operating within a culture that discouraged questioning authority. Anatoly Dyatlov's insistence on proceeding with the test despite mounting evidence of problems was not simply personal stubbornness. It reflected a system that demanded results, that punished failure, and that valued hierarchy over technical judgment. The junior operators who expressed concerns but ultimately followed Dyatlov's orders exemplify another dimension of the problem. They suspected something was wrong. They raised objections. But when their superior dismissed their concerns, they deferred to his authority. In a different organizational culture, one that truly valued safety over hierarchy, they might have refused to proceed or escalated their concerns to higher authorities. But the Soviet system had trained them to obey, and they did. This is a decision that nobody dared to question, not because the concerns didn't exist, but because the culture made questioning impossible. This lesson extends far beyond nuclear power. In aviation, medicine, military operations, financial services, and countless other fields, catastrophic failures often result from cascading poor decisions made by people who are under pressure, who are overconfident, and who operate within cultures that discourage dissent. The Challenger space shuttle disaster in 1986, which occurred just months after Chernobyl, shared similar characteristics. Engineers who raised safety concerns were overruled by managers focused on schedule pressures and organizational goals. The 2008 financial crisis involved systemic risks that many people recognize but few dare to act upon. Chernobyl reminds us that technological systems are only as safe as the human and organizational systems that operate them. Today, the Chernobyl site remains a stark reminder of these lessons. The new safe confinement, completed in 2016, stands as one of the largest movable structures ever built, a massive steel arch designed to contain the radioactive remains of Reactor 4 for at least a century. The exclusion zone, gradually being reclaimed by nature, serves as an eerie monument to human failure and hubris. Pripyat's abandoned buildings, frozen in 1986, have become a popular destination for dark tourism, drawing visitors fascinated by the apocalyptic landscape. The ultimate legacy of Chernobyl is this: the most dangerous component of any technological system is not the hardware or the physics, but the human and institutional factors that govern decision-making. We can design safer reactors, better control systems, and more robust safety protocols. But if the culture discourages questioning authority, if institutional pressures override safety concerns, if people are afraid to stop a process once it's begun, then no technical safeguards will be sufficient. The secret behind the Chernobyl explosion was not a mysterious technical failure or an unforeseeable accident. It was a decision perceived with a dangerous test despite multiple warning signs, made by a senior engineer who was confident he could control the situation and not questioned by subordinates who suspected otherwise but remained silent. That silence, that inability to question a decision that everyone feared might be wrong, is Chernobyl's most haunting legacy and its most important lesson for future generations. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. See you next time